Hello and welcome to another episode of Spar Talk. Today we're bringing you the second main presentation from our 9th International Conference. And as you can probably tell by the title of the episode, it's about why the Trotskyist movement is in a crisis. More specifically, Comrade Vincent tries to put forward an explanation for why the Fourth International collapsed into multiple competing tendencies, none of which could figure out their purpose and tasks in the changed world situation following World War II. This led to disorientation, which expressed itself in either Stalinophilia or liquidation into various nationalist movements, or Stalinophobia and sterile abstentionism, which equated Washington and Wall Street with the Kremlin. These problems persist in the movement today, yet none of the Trotskyist tendencies are able to grapple with them in a way that also acknowledges the errors of their own tendencies historically. This applies to them as much as it does to us. This talk, which will soon be in video form on YouTube as well as in the pages of Spartacist in the coming weeks, is as much about the collapse of the Fourth International as it is a lesson on how to understand the crisis of the left in a materialist way, something which other traditions from the Stalinists and the Maoists and whoever else would also do well to learn from. We hope you enjoy this talk. And as always, we welcome criticism and comments of any kind. I'm sure that those within the Spartacist periphery will have lots of feelings and lots to say, all of which I look forward to.
In 1933, after Hitler's rise to power and the disastrous betrayal of the German working class by the Comintern, Trotsky declared the old international dead for the proletarian revolution and called for the foundation of a new Fourth International. 5 years of struggle against incredible odds, from state repression to Stalinist murders and fascist advances, led to the founding Congress of the Fourth International in 1938. The document it based itself on, known as the Transitional Program, made a proud and defiant promise to rally the internationalist forces behind a clear banner on the eve of the Second World War and cohere those cadres who, if small in numbers, nevertheless were the pledges for the future. Tragically, however, the Fourth International would not live up to this promise. World War II almost destroyed the organization. Countless among our best comrades who fought in heroic conditions were murdered at the hands of fascists and Stalinists, starting with Trotsky in this very city. Emerging from the war, the Fourth International faced a world it could not understand, with most of its parties remaining small groups, with a few exceptions of Bolivia, Sri Lanka, or Vietnam. In 1953, the Fourth International had fractured into a fatal split, and those splits would themselves split again and again, most often in confused and obscure disputes. Fast forward to today, there have been at least 66 different rival international tendencies claiming the mantle of Trotskyism, with at least 41 still in existence today, according to Comrade Jonah's calculation. Each of these current would proclaim to be the real continuity of Trotskyism against all the other revisionists. These are the symptoms of a movement in crisis, which we must understand if we are to claim to unite the revolutionary forces today. 88 years have passed since the founding Congress of the Fourth International. The world has changed greatly. From the rise of new worker states to the counter-revolutionary destruction of the USSR. Yet, the very same questions that broke the back of far more experienced cadres are haunting us again today. US hegemony, which established its rule as Trotskyists were emerging from the ruins of World War II, is now in decline, lashing out globally to maintain its position. Nationalist forces, pushed into conflict with US imperialism, are exerting a powerful pull on the oppressed. And the primary counterweight to the American empire is the Communist Party of China, the very same one whose rise to power in 1949 so deeply disoriented Fourth Internationalists. And the revolutionary movement is today in an even deeper state of weakness and disorientation, isolated from the working class. So, comrades, either we learn from history or we are condemned to repeat it. But how can we learn from history when the Trotskyist movement is incapable of telling its own? The anti-Pabloite claimed that Pablo single-handedly destroyed the International by abandoning proletarian centrality. Pablo's defenders argue that Cannon and Healy were just sterile dogmatists stuck in their ways. Workers' Power explains that the International was destroyed by epigons who abandoned Trotsky's doctrines. And the RCI preaches that Ted Grant alone understood dialectics, while everyone else was ignorant of it. Even in our own tendencies, Genesis of Pabloism, despite its genuine insights, insisted that Cannon held the flame of revolutionary continuity, even though he clung to sterile orthodoxy. How does that make sense? And so, for many young militants today, the history of the Fourth International feels like an incomprehensible web of obscure squabbles. And it feels incomprehensible because it is, at least with this method. History is reduced to personal betrayals and psychological defects, with tendencies arguing over who wrote what in some article or internal bulletins decades ago. And this confusion is not an accident, comrades. It's a reflection of the crisis of our movement. Every tendency writes history from the standpoint of their own existence, forced to create an unbroken line of orthodoxy that conveniently ends with their own small groups as the true heir of Trotskyism. This is why you can't make sense of anything. Yet for those outside of the Trotskyist movement, what is patently obvious is that our entire movement has been in a crisis since 1945. So who is right? How to determine this, to make sense of the mess? The study of the Fourth International poses point blank the question of what is revolutionary leadership. Organizations claiming to be revolutionary cannot be judged by programmatic purity on paper, by the personal qualities of leaders, by the accuracy of their prognoses alone, or by their skill in recruitment processes also. The true revolutionary mettle of a tendency is tested concretely. In the course of great events, did it fight for a strategy of struggle which advanced the interest of the working class as a whole? Or did it become the tool for another force? And this is not an abstraction. In the post-war period, we saw the birth of the American Empire, launching the Cold War against the USSR. It saw the Red Army liquidate the capitalist classes in half of Europe. It saw mass social revolutions in Yugoslavia, China, and Korea, led by Stalinist forces. And it saw a titanic wave of colonial uprisings under bourgeois nationalist leaderships. These are the tests. The question to pose to aspirant revolutionaries is, were they able to stand on the right side of the barricades? And if so, did they put forward an independent strategy to genuinely advance these struggles, one capable of breaking the masses away from their non-revolutionary leaders? And viewed from this standpoint, it becomes obvious that none of the tendencies of the Fourth International rose to this challenge. This does not mean that specific tendencies at specific juncture were not able to carry out revolutionary intervention. And it certainly does not negate the courage and determination of thousands of militants who sincerely fought for the Fourth International and sometimes paid for this with their lives. But to ensure these sacrifices were not in vain, we must develop a coherent explanation for the collapse of our movement. One that is not merely self-serving, but that goes directly to the root of the crisis. So, my thesis, the central task posed after 1945 was the struggle against the American empire. And the task of Trotskyists was to put forward an internationalist and revolutionary strategy to defeat it, in opposition to those of the Stalinists and nationalists, who were the main forces leading workers in the oppressed. Neither the Pabloites nor the anti-Pabloites were able to do this. After the war, the movement retreated into rigid pre-war dogmas. This sterile orthodoxy bred Stalinophobia, which, in the heat of the Cold War, generated a sharp reaction in the opposite direction: liquidation into Stalinism and nationalism, or what will be called Pabloism. Ultimately, because both these trends failed the test, neither could justify the independent existence of Trotskyism as a living, necessary political force for the working class in the post-war era. And this is the root cause of the 1953 splits, as well as the endless successions of splits into ever smaller groupings. Thus, should we simply throw away this heritage? This would only guarantee the repeat of the same errors. Every tendency in the Fourth International reflected a piece of social reality and held a grain of truth. The Pabloites understood that revolutionaries had to link themselves to the masses, particularly in the national liberation struggles. The anti-Pabloites understood that the Marxist program had to be defended against the blind alley of nationalism and Stalinism. Both were right, yet both lacked a method capable of combining these elements, which is the essence of revolutionary leadership. Fractured into two broken halves, the movement was condemned to a false choice between opportunist liquidation and sectarian isolation. So I cannot today tell the full history of the Fourth International, but what I can do is try to rescue some of the vital political lessons necessary for our task today. The end of World War II opened a new chapter in history. And it also tore up the playbook of the Trotskyist movement had relied upon for a decade. Okay. Trotskyist cadres entered 1945 armed with predictions derived from the pre-war era, expecting a repeat of the 1930s. A deep economic crash, the collapse of the Soviet bureaucracy, and the rapid discrediting of Stalinist and social democratic parties as they betrayed the post-war revolutionary wave. However, history did not unfold in this way and took a massive, unforeseen turn. While the temporary diplomatic theater of Yalta and Potsdam initially masked the New World Order, with the USSR collaborating with the Allies to carve out the world and crush revolutionary openings, a profound structural shift was happening. The dropping of the atomic bomb and the complete dominance of the US over all other capitalist powers signaled the end of the multipolar inter-imperialist rivalries, and in its place stood the American Empire, which we spoke about a lot yesterday. Through its financial, industrial, and military dominance, the United States rebuilt the old imperial powers, Britain, Japan, Germany, France, etc., and unified them under its leadership. And instead of sinking into economic crisis, the United States was able to marshal its enormous resources and global pillage to prop up the world capitalist economy and rebuild bourgeois democracy in Europe. And all of this was done for a single purpose: confront and destroy the Soviet Union and contain the colonial revolution. On the other side, the Soviet bureaucracy emerged from the war massively strengthened. The Red Army occupied half of Europe, and communist parties commanded millions of workers. And while a revolutionary wave did erupt in Western Europe, it was swiftly quashed by the Stalinists. Instead, the center of gravity for revolutionary struggles would shift to the colonial world, where a decades-long wave of titanic uprisings unfolded, exploiting the vacuum left by the decline of the old British and French empires. These revolting millions looked for leadership not in the small cadres of the Fourth International, but in powerful Stalinist and nationalist forces. Exceptions were in Bolivia and Sri Lanka, which I will not be dealing with today. The Fourth International, therefore, found itself isolated, small, and profoundly disoriented. The leaders of the movement, from Michel Pablo and Ernest Mandel, who emerged from the underground in Europe, to James Buchanan in the US, proved incapable of squaring this new reality with the literal text of the 1938 transitional program. Rather than responding to new problems with new answers, they clung to outdated predictions and retreated into a defensive, rigid orthodoxy. So year after year in this period, official documents and resolutions stubbornly predicted an imminent economic meltdown, the rise of European fascism, and the coming World War III, completely blind to the capitalist stabilization happening in Europe. This disorientation paralyzed their strategy towards the masses. Fourth International leaders mechanically assumed that the betrayal of Stalinists would automatically drive millions into the ranks of the Fourth International. All that was needed was to list the Stalinist betrayal, raise transitional demands, which were elevated mechanically as the solution to every problem, and voila. The 1946 thesis of the International Second Conference proclaimed that, quote, "The swelling of the ranks of the traditional organizations in Europe, above all the Stalinist parties, has now reached its peak almost everywhere. The phase of decline is beginning." 1946. In the United States, the SWP's 1946 central document Thesis on the American Revolution projected an economic crash and working class explosions, completely ignored the Communist Party, and predicted uninterrupted successes for the SWP. I'll let Comrade John B. speak more on this. In India, the Bolshevik-Leninist Party of India fought the Congress Party, but with the assumption that, given its bourgeois character, it would never be able to free India, a course which would soon face a rude awakening. Stuck in sterile orthodoxy, the Fourth International was incapable of understanding how the incipient Cold War was forcing Stalinist and nationalist leaders into a confrontation with the American empire and its imperial partners. Because they could not grasp these living dynamics, they dismissed mass support for these leaderships as mere subjective and temporary confusion. Unable to engage the real contradictions within these movements, the International retreated into an abstract, European-centric framework, paying lip service to the colonial revolution while remaining politically blind to its true significance and specific tasks. There were multiple attempts by cadres to challenge this sterile framework, notably the Golden Moro faction in the SWP and British RCP. Felix Moro argued against the SWP majority that US imperialism was pouring massive resources into Europe, which was stabilizing capitalism, rendering the International's catastrophic predictions completely moot. Dismissed as a rightist who wanted to liquidate the socialist program in favor of democratic demands, Moro was in fact combating the movement's maximalist outlook. Recognizing a real revival of democratic illusions among European workers, he insisted that democratic demands were vital to compete with mass social democratic and communist parties. He wrote, quote, "The problem of problem is to tear the masses away from the SP and CP. The way to do this is on the vital political questions which actually arise and appear vital to the masses, and not on the questions we think vital." And at least this had the merit of posing the task on the right terrain. The international leaders responded mainly with rigidity, counterposing democratic demands to calls for Soviets. And it's really the sterility which drove Felix Moro towards Shatman, leading him to reject the defense of the USSR in 1946 and to his expulsion eventually. So the point isn't that Moro or Goldman were right. They had tons of problems, from illusions in bourgeois democracy to Zionist position on Palestine. But they were putting their fingers on real problems, which, if addressed, could have reoriented potentially the international. Ted Grant and the British RCP also fought the international's wrong analysis. They've submitted multiple amendments at various congresses, correctly identifying the early stages of the post-war boom. Grant debunked the international's apocalyptic perspective, characterizing, correctly in my opinion, the situation in Europe as a counter-revolution in democratic form. And Grant and his co-thinker were eventually marginalized by Healy's maneuvers and eventually purged. However, reading Grant's critique, one is struck by how it reflects the same academic method that plagues the RCI today. For Grant, perspective were everything. Politics was reduced to an intellectual exercise in correct prognosis. His analysis almost never drew concrete political tasks. Grant was right about the post-war economic boom, but what did that actually mean for the task of the party? It was never spelled out. Same thing in Yugoslavia and China, his future writing, which were quite correct analytically on many points. But what should Trotskyists actually do? He never answered this question. And so the quashing of the Goldman-Moro tendency and the British RCP only led to the doubling down of a sterile course. In the SWP, Cannon's thesis on the American Revolution was adopted at the same plenum, which saw the final showdown with Moro. In Lessons of October, Trotsky warned, quote, "The party that does not keep step with the historical tasks of its own class becomes, or run the risks of becoming, the indirect tool of other classes." This is precisely what happened to the Fourth International between 1945 and 1948. Incapable of understanding that the task of the epoch was the struggle against the American empire in the growing Cold War, and unable to understand the source of Stalinist influence, the Fourth International's retreat into a sterile method led it to frequently capitulate to the growing anti-Soviet rhetoric of the US-led democratic imperialist camp. First, already in 1946, the Fourth International raised the slogan for the immediate withdrawal of Soviet troops from Eastern Europe. In the context of US encirclement, this completely misread the main line of battle. Wherever the Red Army withdrew, as in Austria or Iran, US imperialism immediately stepped in. What the slogan ignored was also the deeply contradictory character of the Red Army. It was certainly used by the bureaucracy to commit crimes against the working class, which had to be denounced, but as the armed fist of the Soviet Union, it also struck terror into the local capitalist classes. Demanding its unilateral withdrawal did not aid the development of revolutionary upheavals. It would have only aided Western imperialism and local reaction. I believe, Comrade Probsting, you failed to grasp this point. Second, in the trade unions, giving the treachery and violence of Stalinists, which was real, let's not underestimate it, the interventions of Trotskyists, too often degenerated into opportunist blocs with quote-unquote democratic pro-imperialist elements. In France, the PCI maintained a bloc with the leadership of Force Ouvrière, an anti-communist split from the CP-led CGT. And in the US, the SWP repeatedly sought blocks with pro-democratic party bureaucrats against the Communist Party. And this contributed to discrediting Trotskyists in the eyes of communist workers. Third, the main manifesto of the 1948 Second World Congress of the Fourth International was titled
Please slow down.
Against Wall Street and the Kremlin. That was the title of the main manifesto. In the midst of the Cold War, this was a thoroughly third campist position. While documents from the Congresses did maintain a general position in defense of the USSR, they spoke of the Cold War in the most neutral terms. Under the immense pressure of the democratic bourgeoisie, prominent internal currents like the Johnson Forrest faction, Tony Cliff, and even Natalia Sedova, Trotsky's widow, were openly declaring that the USSR had now become state capitalist or imperialist. Clinging to dogmas, the International spent years leading up to 1948 claiming it was impossible for movements under Stalinist leadership to carry out any social overturn. In China, they insisted that the CP could only betray. In Eastern Europe, as the ruling classes were being systematically liquidated by the Red Army, the Fourth International doubled down in denying reality.
Please slow down.
Gosh, man. And so the fear that accepting reality would lead to conciliating Stalinism was really paralyzing the comrades. So for all these reasons, it is absurd to claim that the Fourth International was somehow revolutionary before the rise of Pabloism, as we have argued. And I believe as Workers' Power argued as well, and as the IBT still defends to this day. As the human material to build revolutionary parties were to be found in mass Stalinist parties and militant nationalist movement, the Fourth International's sterile and Stalinophobic course was not halfway revolutionary, but only guaranteed disorientation and isolation. (1948), the year everything changed. A few weeks after the Second World Congress in 1948, the geopolitical ground shattered. Stalin publicly denounced Tito, the leader of the Yugoslav Communist Party. Up until then, the Trotskyist movement knew Stalinism only as a monolithic bloc controlled entirely by Moscow. Now, however, a mass Stalinist party was suddenly denouncing Stalin, borrowing language from Trotskyism, and bringing Yugoslavia to the center of world politics. So this was a shock. Moreover, a closer look at what had happened in Yugoslavia during and after the war revealed something quite extraordinary. While the Red Army had bureaucratically expropriated capitalism from above in Eastern Europe,
Please slow down.
I'm not going to make my time. Yugoslavia's capitalism was smashed by a genuine mass uprising of workers and peasants, led by a Stalinist party independent of Moscow. So Comrade Bert wrote about this, obviously. This was a second major shock, and one very difficult to understand or swallow for anyone clinging to sterile dogmas. So the shockwave continues. A year later, in 1949, the Chinese Communist Party and Mao proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. A mainly peasant army overthrew capitalism and unified the country after a century of pillage and humiliation. This was without a doubt the most consequential revolution in history after the Russian Revolution. Yet the Fourth International's dogmatic predictions had been that the Chinese CP could only betray, and our comrades on the ground were left on the wrong side of history. And I'll let Ray speak more to this. Soon after, in 1950, the Stalinist-led Korean People's Army advanced into South Korea, overturning capitalism and launching the Korean War, in which US imperialism and the People's Republic of China would directly clash. Comrade John Masters wrote about this. So despite being led by Stalinist forces, these transformations were monumental blows against imperialism and resounding victories for the oppressed. But they were also a theoretical catastrophe for the Fourth International. The movement found itself completely isolated from the revolution of its era, unable to understand them. Worse still, these historic victories were being led by the very forces Trotskyists had written off as mere traitors. It was this acute crisis that drove Pablo to push for a sharp turn in the International. That is Pabloism. Yeah, just... he has the text, I mean. So, what is Pabloism? In his famous document, Where Are We Going?, Michel Pablo argued that a global war between the imperialist camp and the Soviet bloc would soon break out. And in 1951, with the Korean War raging, this was not so far-fetched. Pablo characterized the impending conflict as a war revolution, where the combined pressure of Western imperialism and the mobilization of the masses would force the communist parties around the world to fight for power, just like they had done in Yugoslavia, China, Korea, etc. However, this prediction itself was not what was really controversial in the Fourth International. What ignited the explosive controversy were the conclusions Pablo drew. Believing the historical window was closing, he sought to sharply break from the previous course of Stalinophobia and push to get as close as possible to the mass Stalinist and nationalist parties, formalizing the tactic of entrism sui generis. This was entrism of a new kind. Trotskyists were to enter these mass organizations, not for a swift tactical maneuver to split them, but for a prolonged period, aiming at pushing forward the internal revolutionary development he believed were happening inside the communist parties. Decades of factional mythology have totally confused this debate. And to understand what happens next, we have to pause, politically untangle this mess, and ask honestly what was right and what was wrong with Pablo's turn. So I'm going to do something quite dangerous and unprecedented here. I'm going to defend Pablo on a number of points. Comrades at the IBT, fasten your seatbelt. It's about to get worse. But it's essential to cut through the rigid dogmas of the traditional anti-Pablo camp, which our own tendency has, in some cases, repeated. Pablo was trying to grapple with reality. His fatal error was to draw non-revolutionary conclusions from it. So just quickly, the theory of two blocks. The anti-Pabloites raised a hue and cry, denouncing Pablo for viewing the world through the prisms of two camps, US imperialism and the USSR, and claiming that by that he disappeared the class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the workers. Well, this is a rigid, undialectical critique. During the Cold War, the global class struggle was objectively refracted through the concrete antagonism between US imperialism and the Soviet bloc, just as today it is refracted between China and US imperialism. This does not mean that class struggle ceases to exist within those blocks, but social reality is made of multiple layers. And to deny that the world consisted of a struggle really between the imperialist camp and the Soviet Union in the name of a pure bourgeois versus worker line of battle immediately leads to third campism, which always ends up capitulating to imperialism. Again, Comrade Proching, I think you have this exact point in your letter, and I think you formulate it word for word exactly as Blétreau formulated it against Pablo in 1951. Second point, centuries of deformed worker state. Remember the quote from Pablo, we're going to have centuries of this. Okay. A lot of ink has been spilled on this. One can disagree with Pablo's specific timeline. And in writing it, Pablo did lend the Stalinist bureaucracy a historically progressive role, a point I will return to. But Pablo was also highlighting that the transition from capitalism to socialism was proving to be far more complex and tortuous than expected, producing revolutionary processes that did not fit neatly the established norms of October 1917. This wasn't true, or there's some truth in this. And Pablo was also arguing that the victories of anti-capitalist revolutions, even if led by Stalinist parties, were deepening the internal crisis of Stalinism, which is also true. Entrism sui generis, the ultimate proof of liquidationism. It was entirely correct to seek entry into mass Stalinist and nationalist organizations, even with a long-term perspective. Whether this is possible depends on the concrete. But Pablo pushed this explicitly against the Stalinophobic course of the previous period, and often the accusation of liquidation were often a defense of this. So if the raw material for the vanguard was to be found inside the organization controlled by the French Communist Party or the Colonial Liberation Movement, while the Fourth International had only small propaganda groups, it made sense to seek to enter. The problem was not the tactic, it was the political justification for it, which I'll come to in a minute also. Don't worry, I have a whole section on what's wrong with Pabloism. The nature of Stalinism. Many accuse Pablo of revisiting the nature of Stalinism. He definitely did, but not in the way the anti-Pabloites claim. The SWP's main line of attack against Pabloite was the mantra, Stalinism is counter-revolutionary through and through. And once again, Comrade Probsting, I think you have almost this exact formulation in your notes, so the rest will be a polemic, obviously. So, this formula isn't just disorienting, it is false. The smashing of the capitalist state, the destruction of landlordism, the expulsion of imperialism, even if carried under bureaucratic control, is the opposite of counter-revolution. It is highly progressive. Trotsky noted the same as well. And furthermore, in China, Yugoslavia or Korea, and elsewhere as well, social revolutions were the product of powerful revolutionary upsurge of the masses, pushing Stalinist leaders to go way beyond what they wanted. So while Pablo did predify those forces, his opponents simply wrote off the deep, living contradictions within those movements. So the labeling of Stalinism as counter-revolutionary through and through, or social revolutions led by Stalinists as counter-revolutionaries, was just really a lazy way to sweep a problem away rather than solving it. And the surest way as well to guarantee the isolation of Trotskyists. Capitulating to Tito. Pablo certainly capitulated to Tito. So did Healy, so did Cannon. But critics who were quick to point this out, like Ted Grant, or I think our pamphlet also by Norden, usually had no orientation whatsoever to the Yugoslav Revolution. Characterizing the Tito-Stalin split as a struggle between two bureaucracies, which it was often used as an excuse for abstention. And so Pablo was right to want to influence the Yugoslav Communist Party, including its upper layers, in that context. The problem, again, is what do you say to the Yugoslav Communist Party? Which is where Pablo was obviously wrong. So more could be said, but the point I want to make is that Pablo wasn't just some chemically pure opportunist, and his critiques were often just as much revising basic Marxism. And that's important to understand. So let's get to it. What exactly is wrong with Pabloism? Because we're accused of being neo-Pabloites by the comrades of the IBT. But for me, this accusation shows that the accusers don't understand, I think, what Pabloism actually is. So Pablo's entire analysis was based on the notion that, quote, communist parties retain the possibility, in certain circumstances, of roughly outlining a revolutionary orientation. So In those situations, he said, these parties cease to be Stalinist parties, strictly Stalinist parties. And here is really the nub of revisionism, what really robbed Trotskyism of a raison d'être. History has shown that under certain specific conditions, a revolutionary uprising from the masses, a huge pressure from imperialism, the weakness of the local bourgeoisie, in those conditions, Stalinist parties and even petty bourgeois organizations can go way beyond the aims of their leaderships, fight for power, and even break with capitalism. This is without a doubt a revolutionary act. But it is not a revolutionary orientation. This is an ambiguous formulation used by Pablo and others to basically argue that those communist parties had become revolutionary. The problem is that the seizure of power in one country does not complete the revolution. It only initiates it. As long as imperialism remains, the conquest of a single country continues to be subject to imperialist asphyxiation and the threat of reversal. Therefore, a revolutionary orientation can be nothing but a conscious strategy for world revolution. That is what the early Comintern was built for. And this is not the path the Chinese, Yugoslav, or Korean communist parties were following. They did not cease to be Stalinist parties. Pablo reduced Stalinism to the following of orders from Moscow. But that's not what Stalinism is. Stalinism is the subordination of the world revolution to the building of socialism in one country, which leads to peaceful coexistence with imperialism. It arises from the interest of a privileged layer, separated from the masses and caught between them and world imperialism. Tito leaned on US imperialism against the Soviet Union, leading to his total capitulation in the face of the Korean War. Mao's foreign policy was geared towards preserving the People's Republic at the expense of world revolution, as seen with the huge pressure he put on the Vietnamese Communist Party to accept partition in 1954, or the later betrayal of the Indonesian Communist Party. So of course Pablo was correct to support these revolutions. He was correct to argue that Trotskyists had to link themselves to the masses under Stalinist leaderships, including through entry tactic. But what was fatal and totally revisionist in his tactic was that they were all motivated not by the need to forge a revolutionary current within them, under difficult conditions, certainly, but they were motivated by the illusion that under objective circumstances, the communist parties would become revolutionary. And this notion was quickly extended to all sorts of forces, the MNR in Bolivia, Ben Bella in Algeria, and even the left wing of the Labour Party, God forbid. And this raised the awkward question. What's the point of Trotskyism then? If Tito and Mao had basically projected a revolutionary orientation, if other CPs were going to do the same, and even nationalist formation, well, what's the point of us? And what would be our difference with them? And what the Fourth International often tried to do was to raise workers' democracy. And the legalization of Trotsky's party. We're going to fight for workers' democracy while supporting in general the revolution. But the slogan for workers' democracy alone is not a fundamental counterposition to Stalinism, nor is it a historical justification for a separate tendency of the communist movement. It's just like in a trade union, right? The demand for workers' democracy, while crucial, acquires a revolutionary significance only as part of a broader internationalist strategy. The fundamental reason the bureaucracy cannot tolerate the free expression of the working class is to maintain its privilege, as well as to conciliate imperialism at the expense of the working class. And I want to quote someone here, quote, "The historical justification for our movement does not reside in the fact that it is more democratic than Stalinism, that it makes the revolution with less overhead expenses, or that it is alone capable of constructing a socialist society. Its only possible justification, confirmed by 3 dramatic decades, resides in the incapacity of Stalinism to overturn world capitalism," end quote. These words are from Ernest Mandel in 1951. They are absolutely correct, but they were used to defend Pablo's course of support to Tito and Mao, and what he meant by Stalinist was only Moscow. And so the whole problem boils down to the fact that Trotskyism had no fundamental answer to Stalinism as it existed in the post-war period and couldn't make any decisive contribution to the revolutionary movement. And once again, we're back to the point with I started. The task of the era was the defeat of the American empire. The only clear counterposition the Fourth International had to make to Tito, to Mao, to all the communist parties, the nationalist leaders, was on the terrain of world revolution. This isn't an abstraction. It meant developing a serious strategy seeking to defend the worker states based on the intensification of the class struggle abroad against imperialism. And then, from this standpoint, denounce the bureaucracy's accommodation with imperialism and denounce their narrow and nationalist strategies to defend the worker state at the expense of the international proletariat. And this was really the only path to undermine the bureaucracy, to build a genuine communist current and prepare the political revolution. And it was also the only path to give the Trotskyist movement a real coherence and a historical role, by positioning it as the most consistent anti-imperialist faction of the communist movement in the world struggle against the US empire. Obviously, this isn't what the anti-Pabloites argued. In France, the majority under Marcel Blétreux were the first to fight Pablo. They attacked him on dozens of points, yet on the core strategic error, they agreed. The French majority explicitly argued that the Chinese Communist Party had ceased to be Stalinist. They openly agreed that CPs could project a revolutionary orientation, and they ridiculed the idea of Stalinism without Stalin. What they really opposed was the immediate, practical perspective of entry into the French Communist Party, an organizational dicta that Pablo did impose on them in a totally bureaucratic manner, I should say. And that led to their exclusion. In the United States, the split in 1953 developed along different yet equally disoriented lines. The Cochrane-Clark minority fully embraced Pablo's objectivist ideas. So the Cochrane-Clark fully embraced Pablo's objectivist ideas, while at the same time opposing the Stalinophobia of Cannon's leadership and trying to grapple with the real challenges posed by the McCarthyite period. And in response, the SWP majority, it's not that they fought too little and too late. Unfortunately, I have to say, is that they really doubled down on rigid orthodoxy. So they defended Cannon's 1946 thesis on the American Revolution in 1953 as almost like a mythical text. It's like, oh, if you don't believe in it, you don't believe in the party. Remember? Anyway, we have a bit of a history in these sorts of fights. And Cannon and the majority really waged an internal war under the banner of Stalinism is counter-revolutionary through and through, which is false. And this fight really only deepened the SWP's disorientation. And right after the minority's expulsion, the SWP just quit the Fourth International without even bothering fighting within its structure. The American, British, and French sections would go on to form the International Committee. Our tendency has claimed that they represented the revolutionary continuity, albeit with a heavy dose of criticism, to be fair. But the truth is that the International Committee was equally incapable of offering a Marxist response to the fundamental question of our movement. While Pablo openly tailed the Stalinist and nationalist movements, the International Committee retreated into a thoroughly sectarian, sterile, and reality-denying approach to those same movements. It later denied that a revolution happened in Cuba. The SWP acknowledged only in 1955 that one took place in China. And one of the most damning indictments of this split is its geography. By 1953, the majority of the Fourth International membership was now located in the colonial and semi-colonial world, across Latin America and Asia. Not a single one of those sections went with the International Committee at first, it was born as a handful of groups exclusively located in the imperialist core, while the Third World went with Pablo. And this is the tragedy of the 1953 fracture. The Trotskyist movement split into two broken halves, neither of which could offer a coherent revolutionary answer to the Stalinist and nationalist forces in the fight to defeat the American empire. I will briefly conclude. Some comrades might wonder, okay, yes, maybe what you're saying is correct, but would it have made a difference? Even with the best program, weren't the Trotskyists facing impossible situations, tiny in the face of Stalinist and nationalist armies? Isn't it easy to say this in hindsight? A program isn't a magic wand. That said, the easiest thing one can do in politics is to underestimate the power of a correct orientation, one which actually corresponds to the historical steps and developments. If the Fourth International had understood its tasks, it would have at least like a purpose and a coherence. It would not have turned it immediately into a mass organization. It was impossible in the 40s, early 50s. But so many disorienting and destructive fights could have been avoided, and huge opening could have been exploited. And crucially, by the mid-1950s, when dissatisfaction with Stalinism was growing, thousands or more would have found a solid and coherent movement to rally to and find real answers to the question of Stalinism, nationalism, imperialism. The ultimate lesson of this history is that a movement without a compass is doomed. Fundamentally, the Fourth International disintegrated because it failed to grasp that the central task of the era was the fight against the American empire. And today, the vast majority of the Trotskyist movement repeats the same error, labeling China as imperialist, just as it is the American empire which is sowing war and destruction to the four corners of the globe. Can I just get a minute?
Objections?
And on the other side, many fighters in the global south think that the Chinese Communist Party is genuinely revolutionary, even though it enables the US offensive and demoralizes the working class. These are the very questions that broke the Fourth International. The task of revolutionaries today consists precisely in providing a revolutionary answers to this polarization, in forging a revolutionary synthesis of what was good with the Pabloites, what was good with the anti-Pabloites, reject what was wrong, and fuse them. That's what revolutionary leadership consists of. And building a current which can today say, with China against the US, with the world proletariat against the bureaucracy. And this is how we can give a renewed and deeper meaning to our slogan, Reforge the Fourth International, World Party of Socialist Revolution.
Well, I ain't got no smoke, at least not with you. And I don't know if you don't know, but there are just a few of oligarchs and capitalists profiting massive profits, holding us down in lockstep. And your vote, it ain't gonna stop them.